All right, thank you for joining us for You Have to Read the Pictures Too, Visual Literacy and Analyzing Graphic Text with Students. My name is Betsy Gomez, and I'm the coordinator for the Banned Book Suite Coalition, an educational consultant for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, and an educational content developer. In this discussion, our panel of experts will demonstrate techniques and tools for building students' critical literacy skills and with graphic text. The panelists will compare comics with other texts, describe how to lead students in analyzing the elements of comics, and share tips, activities, and vocabulary you can use in your classroom. Before I have the panelists introduce themselves, I'd like to thank WonderCon for supporting comics in education and making this discussion possible. With that, let's meet the panelists. Could each of you take a moment to introduce yourselves, what you teach, and the age group with which you generally work? Tracy, let's start with you.
Hi, I'm Tracy Edmunds, and I am a former elementary school teacher, mostly K-1. I love the little guys. And now I am an educational curriculum specialist. I create books and learning resources, and I particularly specialize in using comics and graphic novels with students.
Thank you, Tracy. Laurence, introduce yourself for us.
I'm Laurence Tan, also known as LT. I am an elementary school teacher in the upper grades. Between 4th and 5th is my sweet spot. I'm currently a lead teacher in Oakland.
Great, thank you. Jennifer, could you let the folks know who you are?
Hi, I'm Jennifer Naumann. I teach 7th grade at Waite Middle School in Norwalk, and I've been a teacher for 17 years.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Shveta, could you introduce yourself, please?
I'm Shveta Miller. I taught English language arts at the high school level for about 15 years, and now I mostly work as a consultant and professional development provider for high school teachers across the country, and coach and curriculum writer.
Great, thank you so much. And finally, we have Derek. Tell the folks about yourself.
There we are. Hi, everybody. I'm Derek Heid. I presently teach AP Lit and English ELA 9 at the high school level out here in Temecula. I've been doing so for the last 11 years.
All right, thank you so much. All right, before we go to sharing our screens, I'm actually going to ask the panel a quick question. Let's talk about why you choose to use comics and graphic novels with your students. What does the format offer that can't be found in other media?
I'll go first. I used to teach reading intervention, and I had a group of boys between 3rd and 5th grade, none of whom were readers yet. And I discovered that the only thing they wanted to read was graphic novels. So I've seen that power of engagement. Kids love them. I mean, honestly, that's one of the best reasons to use them is because kids love to read them.
I'll follow. As a person who learned high-level vocabulary as a youngster reading comics, and highly engaging in that medium of youth culture, I brought those sensibilities to education, and just so happens they also were into the same thing. It never phased out, ever. And so being able to tap into youth culture, and in my own experiences, we made these connections and developed curriculum that was engaging and met the standards for that. So it was definitely an engagement piece and essential for some of the buy-in of what I'll talk about later.
I'll follow up. In addition to the engagement aspects, we're also talking about a world that is becoming more progressively visually oriented. I mean, we think in visual, we think in concept, we don't think in word, or at least we don't think in text written words. So for me, graphic literature was a reasonable extension to the kind of critical thinking and story analysis that we do normally. It's just removing the sometimes imperfect middleman of written or spoken text.
I'll go next. For me, the journey started about 4 years ago. I had a group of students that, no matter how many book talks or book clubs I did with young adult fiction or anything I tried to bridge to the classics, they just weren't having it. And I brought in, I said, I give up. I gotta do something. So I brought in Mouse and Persepolis and American-born Chinese, and it just took off from there. And then I discovered March, and then there was a whole group of students that I found out were interested in like issues that mattered to me too. And we were able to connect on a level that before they weren't readers and we just weren't having a good time together. So, and then this year I brought in comic books, and oh my God, I'm never going back to not having comic books in my classroom.
I agree with all of what was said, and I'll add that the pivotal moment for me, which made me realize how essential this wasn't going to just be something every other year or an elective. It was critical for at least in my high school English language arts setting, was when students actually learned the language of comics and graphic narrative themselves to create their own stories. It was very obvious year after year, the work they were turning in allowed them to express hard truths about their lives and communities that they really didn't have the language to express before in just prose. So we'll probably touch more on that today, but also, like Derek was saying, that the complexity and rigor with which visual texts sort of demand that we engage with them, students need to learn those tools and those methods explicitly. And at the high school level, where they're about to leave us for a variety of other experiences, we just really want them as high school teachers to be equipped with as many critical tools as possible to both read and understand their world, but also to express their own contributions.
Great, thank you so much. I know that each of you have brought some samples of the materials you use in the classroom and some guidance for best practices. So we're going to take this time for each of you to do a quick presentation about your work. We're going to kick it off with Tracy.
All right, let me get my speaker view going here. And I'm going to use my laser pointer. So I want to talk just a little bit about what's the difference between analyzing a prose text with students and analyzing a graphic text. And a lot of what I end up talking to kids about is the choice the creators have made and why they made those choices, because I think that really helps them understand the visual part of it. So I have this great quote here by Brian Chapman from Twitter, that it's all done with intention, and that's part of the key to understanding it. The piece I chose is from this adorable little graphic novel. There's a series of these, Hello Kitty, and you'd think on the surface of it, oh, it's just cute and it's fun and whatever, but you'll be surprised at how deep you can go in analyzing this. This story is called Banana Split. It's a 3-page story by Jacob Chabot, who is fantastic. And the first thing I always do with kids is I let them read it. So I'll put the page up and just wait and let them look at it and let them read it so that everybody's on the same page when we get started analyzing. I would start with, look at the entire page. Why do you think that Jacob Chabot chose to do the background like that? What is the background? And we talk about how, well, he's made the setting fill up the entire page. And why do we think he did that? And then we would look then panel by panel, starting at the top. We have Tim and Tammy. There's Tim and Tammy the monkeys, and they're having a picnic. Well, how do you know they're having a picnic? And so the kids would have to pick out visually. Well, they're on the grass. They have a picnic blanket. They're outside. Must be a picnic. What are they eating? They're eating bananas. So then we go to panels 2 and 3. And the first thing a lot of them will say is, well, look, they match, right? And then we can talk about math concepts like symmetry. So we're looking at symmetrical panels here. The only differences are the outfits that they're wearing, and pretty much everything else is pretty close to the same. A lot of the magic of comics happens between the panels, the things you don't see. And so I asked, what do you think has happened between the first panel and the next 2 panels? And what makes you think that? And if you look carefully, you'll see, even though the monkeys do not have mouths, they have taken a bite of the banana. How do you know that? If you look at the bananas in the first panel, they're all there. And in the second panel, there's a piece missing out of each one as if they've taken a bite. And you put little crumbs so that you can see that they've taken a bite of the banana. Then I asked, well, what are they saying? In this comic, Jacob Chabot is using pictographs instead of using words. So what does the heart mean? Well, pretty much universally, you can guess that that means love. Well, what do they love? Do they love each other? What do they love? And that's a, you know, how do you know? I keep coming back to, how do you know? What tells you this? They aren't in the same panel. They are separated from each other. So it's probably not that they love each other. They are eating the banana. Best guess is they love the bananas. Then we go down to the next panel, next two panels, no longer symmetrical. Notice he has changed the shape of the panels also. They are no longer exactly the same shape. What's happening in that panel? They're both looking at the banana. How do you know that? Their eyes are dots. You can't tell which direction they are looking in. How do you know they're looking at the banana? Body language. They are leaning towards the banana, so you can tell that they are both looking at it. And then, of course, in the next panel, they're both reaching for the banana. I actually pulled some math for some of the younger kids. How many bananas has each monkey eaten? And you have to look at the first panel. How many bananas are there? Then you have to look at the fourth panel where there's only one left. So they have to do the math. How many bananas are missing? How many bananas did each monkey eat? The final panel, what's going on there? And the kids will almost universally say, oh, they're mad at each other. How do you know? What did the artist give us to be able to tell that they're mad at each other? They talk about the brows on the monkeys. You can see these added brows. They aren't in these other pictures. They're only in this one. The brow is down. Everybody make that face. Push your brow down over your eyes. What does that mean? It usually means that you're mad or that you're upset with someone. What does this line in the middle mean? Well, that's to show that they're looking at each other. And then also we're back to symmetry again. The monkeys are exactly the same with one difference. Who sees the difference? You can see that there's a bow over there on Tammy's head, so you can tell which monkey is which. Even without the bow, how could you tell which one's which? Because he established their position earlier on the page and repeats it so that you can then see where they are. I won't do the whole rest of the piece, but I wanted to give it to you so you could see what happened. One of the things I would talk a lot about in this is emanata, which is the little lines and pictures. So if you see up here, the little lines over their head, what do those mean? What are these little puffs around their feet? What do those mean? And these little white lines, does that mean movement? And these little lines and all the little sweat drops, lots of different things like that that are sort of comics specific, that if kids don't know them, you want to talk about what they see and what does that mean. Also here with the two word balloons, you know, sometimes we overlook the placement of word balloons. What does the placement here mean? Well, it probably means that Hello Kitty is saying, hey, split the banana, but these guys are either shouting over her or ignoring her, and they're talking about let's have a contest for the banana. So there's the entire thing. Also, if you want to look at page layout and panels and panel shape and panel placement, clearly this little set of circles over here is a montage. We talked about symmetry. We can talk about lots of other things about panel size and placement. So deceptively simple, but there's a lot here. And I like it with kids at first because there aren't any words. And so not only can they all understand it, but then they can't rely on the words to tell them what's happening. They have to be looking at the pictures. So we'll go back to that later. That's resources, but there you go. That's my my take on analyzing visual text with little ones.
All right, thank you, Tracy. LT, it's your turn.
All right, give me a second. Now, my take is more of a pedagogical approach, because I know the co-panelists might have more. So I'm gonna take it from an ethnic studies lens and developing critical media literacy. And so real quick, we know, comics offer a lot of engagement. I give this the 2 Wings of Fire because I used to have Wings of Fire in my library and very few people touched it other than like that looked like a cool dragon. And then when the graphic novel came out, everyone would gravitate to the graphic novel and then went back to asking me for the books, right? And so it was an entry point for a lot of students whatever stage of literacy they were at. And then obviously you can use that for a buy-in, and now that they trust you. So, but my thing has been to always start with where they're at, right? And so I have a host of things I want to do with them, but I start with Paulo Freire, and he's a Brazilian philosopher, sociologist, and his big thing was you have to be able to read the word as well as the world. And so we as students talk about that, and we start off with looking at comics from Dr. Seuss back in the day, and just kind of problematize as much as we love green eggs and ham and whatnot. And you know, a lot of my students will be like, yo, those are really, really old. Like, that doesn't happen today, does it? And so we challenge them to like really read, first of all, what the messages are saying, what are people learning from these messages, and then how, like, you know, what is done about it. So we start off with that piece, and we develop that literacy, and just looking, and just like very Freirean, where he taught literacy through codex and images to develop language. I've done that with that. Now, again, when a lot of us, we have our great sense of like, this is what I want them to do. Like whenever I want to deconstruct even a hip hop song, I don't do the ones that are socially conscious, because the kids usually aren't aware of it. But you can go to the current music and they'll be on it. So it's very important when I teach even literacy and comics, like we start with where they're at. And so again, Avengers was popping, and kids all of a sudden gravitate to the movies. Thank you, Marvel MCU. And then they opened up the world of reading and comic book consumption for my students. And even if, you know, now they have book levels now. And so after that, though, it's like, okay, so let's analyze it. Let's break it down. Let's do our usual story elements, like the sheets that I have put up here. Let's analyze the characters. And you know, then you start pushing the envelope a little bit, right? And you know, my fifth grader a couple years back was like, how come the majority of the heroes are a particular skin color and have the same body types, right? And so we kind of analyze that a little bit more. And so but we start with where their entry point is and to what they like. I'm not force feeding them stuff. But then once they have that kind of spark, then I start introducing the warrior scholars by expanding their range and critical skills. And then you know, a lot of these are the same graphic novels and text that you use. Now with younger ones, I have to kind of play around with like how far I could take it. And I know that's a question later on, but I definitely, it's in unison with like the parent. Parent consent is key to doing any kind of unit lesson or whatnot. A lot of resources, I have select ones that I use every year, but a lot of good resources are socialjusticebooks.org and Teaching Tolerance that I come from, get some resources from. But I also, the other piece I want to mention is moving beyond consumerism to production, right? And so those kind of skills that the literacy skills that we build on, now the critical literacy skills in particular, well, now how do you address that question that student had? Well, how would you make it different, right? Like if you don't like the representation in the comic book, like what would you do differently? And so they get to develop their own comic book, graphic novel. And I'm just gonna go real quick, but in the grander scheme of things, they do research on real sheroes and heroes in the community to kind of make the connection of like what real heroes have faced like us, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. So here's a sample of a unit projects that I do where, you know, you can see the elements of literature and writing, and they're developing their character. And this was a fifth grader, so 10 years old, obviously influenced by manga. Here's some panels that the student drew out. Wasn't finished, but we took it anyways. It was only supposed to be 3 pages, a beginning part, a middle, and an end. And this person got through 13 pages and said, I'm not done yet. So in honor of his work, here are his pages, and he said to be continued. He just had to stop. But you can see like the engagement of that. Now, just one last piece, steamifying the work, right? So we took that project and now we added they had to develop their action figure. They had to create their own logos using different digital suites, right? Like Tinkercad is this program's Tinkercad. they were making their own theme song to their character using GarageBand and whatnot. So again, the entry point definitely was comic books, but the how you can take it and where you can go with it, it's unlimited. And again, from an ethnic studies approach, we wanted them to become producers and community minded. And so their task wasn't only just to create a character that was referenced to them, but then like what can that person do in the community? And then when we did the STEM piece, the utilities, we started doing robotics and utility devices that would help our communities, right? And so it was like real time. Yes, your hero could use this, but it also helps the community. And so that's where I want to talk about and just and focus on that piece on how critical we can take even young ones, right? I'm teaching third graders this year, and you can even develop these skills over time, and when in fifth grade, you can get a very critical bunch after that. So I'm going to stop sharing screen. Oops. Oh, and then of course here's my info, but I know that is going to be made available later. So
Great, thank you so much. Jennifer, what do you have for us?
All right, I'm gonna just pull this up. Okay, share, sorry. Okay, where is it? Why won't it do this? Okay, can you guys see that? Okay, great. So this is a larger unit that includes comic books and manga now. And I really wanted to take it to like a close reading strategies, include all the standards. So in case I came up against any admin saying, why are you bringing in comic books? This is my intro page. I'm wearing the same shirt. These are my kids, and I have photo releases of them that they signed. So it's okay that they're in the pictures. This was a name as many superheroes as you can think of in 30 seconds. And then you get a prize. And that's Mia, the winner. She's very excited that she won. And I did this with a group of adults too in February. They were really excited too. So these are the essential questions for the unit. These are, so I take it from graphic novel to comic book to manga in this slide. You have March, and then you have the Into the Spider-Verse with Miles Morales. And then you have, I think it's hard to see, but there's a Afro Samurai, which is a African-American Asian like a fusion character. So it's really cool. And there's a series that's narrated by Samuel L. Jackson. So very cool. This is a unit of study. So I'm only going to show part of one of my lessons here. I'm going to share lesson 4, the splash page analysis. But like I said, I'll make all this available afterwards if anybody wants to email me at the end. And so we go all the way into production, what LT was talking about. At the bottom, they create lesson 10 is to create your own graphic novel based on a narrative piece that we wrote earlier in the school year. So this is called 32 Memories. It's from Into the Spider-Verse. It's one of the like top 10 splash pages that every comic book fan should know. And my student was upset because he actually took the time to count, and he said, Miss, there's not 32 memories there. And I said, well, not pictured, but if you look at the black spot in the middle, well, basically what they're saying is it goes further back than you can see. So there's more memories in the picture. So I start with this one, and we talk about what a splash page is. And then we talk about these 3. The one on the far right is called Spider-Man Gives Up. And it was the most provocative that my students talked about this all class period. So I kind of had to turn this into 2 days worth of lessons because we talked a lot. There's a lot to unpack about what a splash page was and what to look for as far as details. So we talk about what it is, where they're typically found in graphic novels. Usually or in comic books, they're usually at the exposition, the climax, or the resolution. So it's really cool to kind of analyze where did your splash page come from what part of the story, because that actually goes into what Tracy was talking about earlier, the artist's decisions about what they include in the picture. We also talk about real estate in comic books and how expensive it is to take up an entire page with one image. So if an artist took the time to make this one whole image and one whole page, then it was very intentional and very expensive. So they wouldn't put it in there for no reason. So that's why I particularly call it out to my students to analyze. This one is from Dwayne McDuffie's Icon, which is actually from the 90s, but it's really cool because we talk about it, again, harkening back to what LT was talking about representation. My students, again, asked the same question. Why aren't there more people of color and people who look like us in the comic book world? And so I try to show them examples where there are. So this is how to read a splash page. We take 2 minutes to just kind of do a brain dump and write down everything we see on the page, all the colors, all the images, all the emanata, all the word bubbles and thought bubbles and everything. And then I have them pick out 3 details that they want to write about and want to talk about, why the artist included it there. What is the artist trying to tell us through these pictures, through these colors that they chose, through the shackles on his arms and legs that have been bronzed. And then we turn this into a splash page analysis paragraph, because I really want them to get more practice with writing and analysis. And it's really just 3 sentences over and over again, but they don't know that. And so when they're done and I tell them that they've written a 9-sentence paragraph, they're very excited about it. And when I actually used this as my evaluation lesson this year for when my principal came in, and my students were explaining to the principal what a splash page was and how to look for details and what those details mean and why the artist included these details in the splash pages. And I gave them all different splash pages. So they got to choose. I put some down on their tables and they got to choose. We had this one, which was a very solitary picture of the Hulk. You know, he's kind of contemplating, and then there's kind of like 2 mind's eye pictures here. So they all had different ones that they looked at in groups, and it was just a really, it went very well, and they loved it. And I just want to talk about this book really quick because DC Inc. is doing these graphic novels for middle schoolers, and this one I read in a day. I loved it, and there are all sorts of splash pages all through this graphic novel. I call this a graphic novelization of a comic book because it's kind of in between the 2 genres. But they use splash pages all over the place, transitions and to introduce new characters. So it's just a really great read.
All right, thanks so much, Jennifer. Okay, Shveta, if you want to queue up your presentation, it's your turn.
All right. Let's see. Okay. And let's get in. All right, so I'm going to focus on an example of reading Persepolis in the classroom at the high school level. And a lot of what we do is similar to what we've already seen in terms of the close reading analysis and really involving students in adding to a collaborative understanding of what's happening on a specific page. So what I'm going to focus on now is a example from my class where I may direct them to just one specific corner of a page, or even sometimes just one specific corner of a panel, so that they are not always so overwhelmed by some of the more obvious things that are happening on a page, or some of the more dramatic techniques, but are really training their eye to look at the most subtle choices that a graphic artist may have included. So here's the kind of famous very first panel from Persepolis, Marjane Satrapi's graphic novel about a girl growing up during the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And so I let students sit with this one image for a while. Independently, they think about what they observe, what their takeaways are. Like Tracy had asked her, even kindergartners, what is happening and how do you know? And when we come together as a whole class, students year after year have made similar conclusions when just looking at this one panel in isolation, which is that they notice her hands are dutifully folded. There's no background, the veil is very heavy and dark, and they often see her expression as unexpressive. And they draw conclusions like, she seems like she's doing what she's told to do. She's very compliant. She's not an individual. There's nothing unique about her. And they draw all sorts of conclusions about what they think is happening in her mind and in her environment at that time. Then we look at the larger page, and we do spend time going in order from left to right as you would typically read a graphic novel. But for purposes of time, I want to jump ahead to the panel at the very bottom, because this is where students realize a huge change in their own thinking, just from the very top of the panel to the bottom one, where now they have a much wider, not that narrow panel with the restricted view. They see a more expansive view here, one that looks like it might even go on further, kind of a bleed. It's going beyond the borders. And what they start noticing now is all of the diverse, rich variety of ways that the students engage with their veils and interact with it. Some in very morbid ways, some very in comic ways. They start talking more about the differences than the similarities. And every year without fail, students come to the conclusion that wow, how did Satrapi do that? She had us really thinking that Margie, the character in that first panel, was this sort of stereotypical Muslim girl, that we really fell into this trap of almost expressing some of our own biases and assumptions about what living with a veil might be like, and what type of person chooses to wear one. And that all of that came into question in a very surprising way for them when just on that same page, they see that assumption really explode and become disrupted. So similar to what we've heard the co-panelists talk about, is that students are writing their own panels as well. So the goal here, like we talked about earlier, is that they aren't just close reading panels and developing an appreciation for different types of texts, but they're really learning more and more tools to tell stories and communicate ideas in a variety of ways. So I invite students to do short micro writing assignments in response to what we're reading, where they are writing in graphic form. So students sometimes keep graphic novel journals through our study of the mentor text, where they record certain panels where they saw a technique like, oh, I want to save that, I want to maybe use that. And they start experimenting with using some of those techniques to tell their own stories. So this is an example of a student who was very inspired by Satrapi's use of that very narrow, restricted view of her own image to really to spark some of the potential biases and assumptions in her readers. And he portrayed himself in a dark hoodie with a hat, no background, just a dark black background, and no expressions on his face, and wanted readers to allow their own sort of maybe biases take hold. Who is this person? Where are they? Why is it dark? What is he up to? And then on the next page of his story, also a splash where it takes up the whole page. You see more. You're zooming out and you see, oh, well, it's black and dark because it looks like it's late at night and it looks like he might be in a library and he's studying. And his intention, his hope was that that may have caused some of his readers, his classmates, to think about, well, why did I assume that he was somewhere else? Where did I assume he was? And so I want to end with a different page from the same graphic novel, Persepolis. And I want to just point out, I know this was talked about a little earlier, the idea of what is in between the panels. So the gutters, those spaces between where readers are being asked to draw conclusions about what happens from one panel to the next. So Tracy opened up by showing a type of panel transition that we would call moment to moment, where the banana is full and in the next panel, one bite is missing. So that, you know, about a moment has passed in between there, and the conclusions to draw may be more simple or immediate. Now, at the high school level, we're engaging with a lot of texts that have what we would call subject to subject transitions, where it's not so clear what do these even have to do with each other. So if you see in this page, in the bottom row of this page, each picture, there aren't just moments between. They could be months apart or even years. So they're not even the same characters in each panel. So what is happening? And our high school students tend to struggle more with drawing conclusions with those panels that don't have obvious connections. And so one teaching strategy I know has worked in the classroom is to first draw students' attention to what is similar about those. So here we talk about not just how they're all in the same row of the page, but also how they're in the same size and shape of a frame. These rectangles are exactly the same size. And then beyond that, really looking at the similarities with the text. And here we can see the syntax. There's parallel constructions with the because clause being repeated. So students learn that those kinds of clues tell them that there's something very similar uniting these very different panels in time. And now I have to do that hard work to make those connections. So I'll just close with some other resources for you. I do have a long sort of all-encompassing description of the Persepolis unit I have taught at the high school level. It's available on the Cult of Pedagogy site. You can also listen to it as a podcast interview, but there is a full discussion of how to implement that unit from start to finish. Including resources like a personal goals chart that I invite students to complete, because again, at the high school level, and Derek may speak to this as well, that our students are coming in with a lot of skills with graphic novel reading already. You can see they might have had Tracy in kindergarten and Laurence and Jennifer in upper elementary and middle school. So at our level, we really need to take stock of what do they already know how to do? What is possible? Where can they go? So I found that it helps to generate a variety of learning objectives and involves students in the process of really selecting some goals that are personally relevant to them and supporting them in that process. I've also included an image here of the single point rubric that I ended up using after a few years of learning the hard way that I use to assess their completed graphic novels that they end up submitting at the end. And I talk more about that in that article. And finally, there is a YouTube video where I model for 10 minutes the type of close reading that we do in class using just one page from Persepolis. And there's an accompanying active viewing sheet that students can use to actually watch that close reading model and engage in the same kinds of analytical skills themselves. Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks so much, Shveta. All right, Derek, it's your turn.
All righty. One moment. Okay, here we go. All righty, guys. The piece that I'm talking about today is the piece I'm actually writing my master's thesis on right now, which is Matt Fraction and David Aja's Hawkeye, My Life as a Weapon. It's one of my favorite pieces to use at the high school level because it does some very interesting things visually and structurally that subverts the expectation of what we would consider to be the superhero genre. And it is a very interesting text compositionally, which we'll talk a little bit about here in brief. The first thing I like to do with any of my texts in the classroom is make sure that they are very clearly aligned to the content standards. I found that in trying to get more mainstreamed comic and graphic literature in front of my students, that there was a resistance to that because it wasn't understood that they were rigorous, and it wasn't understood that they had analytical depth to offer. So my first step is to ensure that I've at least got one Common Core ELA standard aligned to anything I'm doing with the text. In the case of the page that we're looking at in Hawkeye, there's a lot of play with time and sequence, and that fits beautifully with RL 910.5, which deals with how an author uses time and sequence to make some larger thematic or story point. Underneath that, I've got my essential questions. We're going to be focused on essential question A today, asking about how the author's use of time impacts the development of tension, suspense, and character in a piece of literature. The piece we're looking at is this page from the Vagabond Code, which is the second issue of the Hawkeye run that started back in 2012. I like this page because it does a lot with simultaneous storytelling. It plays a lot with closure. It plays a lot with the reader's perspective and messes with our concept of time by telling two simultaneous stories. The questions I ask my students at the outset as we take a look at this page is, what do they notice about the two characters that are depicted? Why are they depicted next to each other? How does that help us to develop some sense of similarity and difference? What information do we obtain out of this sequence that would be less likely to be obtained if it was played at normal speed? The first thing that I point out to them after they've had an initial look at this page is that we're looking at the span of maybe a couple seconds, as long as it takes to say, well, that's cool, which is the text that's spread out in black and white, interspersed with the color pages of Clint Barton firing the arrow. So we're looking at something that is distending time. And the last question I would ask them is, what visual choices have the authors made apart from the distension of time, and what significance do they have? What we find is that we've got two simultaneous storylines happening here. We've got Kate Bishop, our female Hawkeye, saying, well, that's cool, interspersed with Clint Barton, the male Hawkeye, drawing back on the bow, focusing on his target, and finally letting the arrow fly. The things that we notice about this page, the first thing that we notice is that we're slowing down time, and that allows us to learn something about Clint Barton, namely that he is methodical. He's very practiced. He's got a process that he follows through to do something as relatively simple as loose an arrow. Kate ends up being our pacekeeper on this page. She's the one that gives us a sense of how much time is actually passing. This isn't a moment that Clint is drawing back the bow, pausing for several minutes to make sure he's got his aim. All of that happens in the span of 3 words for her. So she allows us to keep pace, even as the page asks us to go back and forth and live in this comparatively small amount of time. That's one of the cool things that graphic literature and graphic novels and comic books do that isn't as easy to do with a text-only piece or with a film. It allows us to kind of pause, revisit, rewind, and live in these moments that would otherwise be gone in the blink of an eye. The last thing that I like about this page is that it demonstrates the difference between these characters. Kate Bishop comes off as flippant, younger, just her casual use of language on this page is nicely juxtaposed with Clint's more methodical, more practiced, and more serious approach to what he's doing. The other thing I like about this page is that it plays with our sense of tension. If we look at this middle section, our tension is ratcheted up by the panels zooming in on both Clint and on his target. There's some interesting conversation that can be had here when we look at the rest of this run. The Fraction and Aja run was only like 19 issues, so it's definitely workable within a school year. In fact, it could be the central text of a unit of study dealing with time and sequence. But there's something interesting to be said about the fact that both subjects, both object and subject, are zoomed in on similarly. It's almost as if we are trying to draw a parallel between them. But I think the best thing that this page does is make the reader the arrow, or the arrow and the bowstring. As the tension ratchets up, as Clint pulls back on the bowstring, the reader is drawn closer and closer and closer. And then at the end, when he lets go, we fly back as well. So there's an interesting narrative space that Aja and Fraction are playing with there, where the reader becomes as taut and as tense as the bowstring itself. Something that we don't have a lot of time to get into today, because we're trying to keep these relatively brief, is the idea of diegetic and non-diegetic storytelling elements, which really come to play in Pizza is My Business, issue 11 in the Hawkeye run. The pizza dog issue is, I think, how it's commonly known. This issue is told specifically from Lucky's perspective, who is Clint's dog, and there's very little play with spoken dialogue there. It's told through semiotics, it's told through symbols, it's told through emanata and other odd, like, I guess the best way to describe them would be like flowcharts of the things that the dog is understanding about his world in a way that a dog would be able to express them. It's all through sense of smell, but it's shown visually. And that gets us onto the topic of diegetic and non-diegetic elements to story, the stuff that the characters can recognize, things like the apartment, things like the characters, the dialogue that is spoken and heard, and the stuff that is non-diegetic, that is there for us but is not present in the character's world, like the flow charts, like the lack and presence of color, like the scribbled out language that represents the stuff that Lucky as a dog wouldn't understand versus the words that he would know, like up and you and his own name. So when we start talking about symbology and semiotics, this issue is an excellent place to start, especially when we talk about how those two, the diegetic and the non-diegetic, work together to convey a story that wouldn't be possible had we focused only on one or the other. So I think at the end of the day, what this issue offers my students most is the ability to see comic books, and specifically the superhero genre, as more nuanced than a character that they might recognize from the MCU, which is definitely a good in route, and that's where a lot of my students already know Hawkeye from. But this gives them a different look at not only the character, but the depth of the story. I think that the MCU has done a nice job of broadening people's understanding of those characters, but with the exception of something like Winter Soldier or Civil War, they're still fairly light watching, and that can mistakenly lead people to think that all superhero stuff is light and not challenging, especially like an administrator or a parent that might view these as light entertainment and not heavy literary merit. So that's, I think, where I'm coming from on this stuff. And now,
All right, great. Thank you so much, Derek. Just a quick time check. It looks like we might run a little bit long. Are you guys okay staying for a little bit? All right. Okay, so just a question for the panel. Let's say an educator wants to use a graphic novel in place of another text. Based on your experience, how can they make that happen, and how might instruction and activities differ or be the same?
Well, I'll from my end, especially on the elementary level, and speaking to Derek's point, yeah, a lot of parents and sometimes administrators were definitely like, wait, picture books, like you're an upper elementary, right? And so part of it has been for me to work with administration, let the administration know I'm going to be doing this unit or I'm going to be using this way. And then also letting the parents know as well, communication on that. And so especially when, we do a unit or we do work with comic books or graphic novels, and then we amp it up to include heavy topics, they're already in the know and they can opt out, or we can find other ways to engage them. So that helps a lot. But the buy-in from the administration and the parents are definitely key. And so once you start off with something accessible, then like the next level is like, oh yeah, you've done this before, okay, you're going to tackle this issue. And so they like, especially administration, never want to feel blindsided, and so when you propose, this is what I'm thinking, and they're like, oh, okay. And then when you actually do it, they're like, oh yeah, you mentioned something about that. Okay. And so let me check it out sometime. So I think that kind of foreknowledge helps out.
Yeah, carrying on with that, one of the things that I've been working hardest on in my district is getting a class on the books at the high school that is explicitly comics as literature. It's an elective class. We finally got it flown. I get to start teaching it next year, but it was years of a process of trying to convince a school board of people that hadn't been in a classroom in a little while and hadn't recognized the kind of evolution of literature, even over the last, 20, 30 years. Resources like March and Mouse, even though we don't want to pigeonhole all of comics and graphic novel instruction to a handful of what we would consider to be like academic comics, those are really handy, because if you can look at March and say, look, this won a National Book Award, you can look at Mouse, you can talk about the heavy conversations that are happening there, then you've got a foundation to say the medium doesn't necessarily limit the complexity. These are doing important things too. The fact that they are using visual as well as textual means to do those things is neither here nor there. The content is what matters.
Well, I would argue actually that to analyze graphic novels is actually more complex in some ways than just analyzing text. You know, comics is a medium or a format, not a genre. And so you have to start out with getting your students to understand the language and how the art form works. But then you also have to analyze the visuals, which you wouldn't have to do in prose text, and you have to analyze how the text and the images work together. So in a lot of ways, it can be even more complex than straight text, and you have to lay the groundwork a little bit. You know, I don't know how many of you, do you actually teach up front some of the vocabulary and conventions of comics, yeah, before you launch into doing something, yeah.
I was just going to say, kind of piggybacking on what Derek was saying, and I think Laurence referenced it too, about linking it to the standards, to the Common Core standards. A lot, again, that's a way to get more mainstream teachers on board with you, and also admin to buy in, because you're basically still doing your job by making it fun and bringing in comics. And I found that I had to like limit how many standards I was covering, because I found out I was covering way more standards with teaching comic books and graphic novels than I was with teaching just fiction. So yeah, I'd say it's much more complex, like Tracy was saying too.
And I'll speak to the part of the question about how it's similar and different in the classroom in terms of when you're teaching prose text versus graphic text. I think there are a lot of similarities, as we've all shown: the rigorous close reading, the close attention to detail, responding and writing, creating your own. One thing that I found was a key difference, like Tracy mentioned, explicitly teaching the unique strategies and elements and devices that they haven't been exposed to all along, and compared to all the prose devices they've seen, is one part that I've done differently is when I am teaching those devices, I found that it works better than providing a list that they can then sort of check off as they're looking at a graphic text, is that I involve them in that concept attainment strategy, where we really just look at examples and non-examples, just images, so that they can kind of come to the conclusions themselves and express the techniques in their own language. Like, for example, with a splash, oh, I see that all of these examples, the pictures filling up the whole page, but in these examples, it's not. There seems to be some kind of edge. And then they learn the terms splash and border and frame and bleed. And also that it helps with when we're doing close reading with prose text versus with graphic text. I found that it's been helpful to adopt strategies from the art world, art and education world, like that have now been called slow-looking strategies. Sherry Tishman has a book out recently where she just kind of summarizes all of those from art educators. So one that sticks out to me that I wouldn't ever think to do with a prose text is really getting the page, that tactile experience for students where they're looking at it and touching at it and engaging with it with all their senses for a long period of time, so that they can really go beyond just those initial observations that they tend to do when looking at anything visual. So just that's kind of been a key difference in the instruction for me.
Betsy, do you mind if I share something real quick? It was the last, I'm going to screen share here, the last page of what I shared earlier. This is there are a couple things that I use. I discovered this page you can see here on the left. This is from a book called The Art of Comprehension by Trevor Bryan. He actually uses this with elementary kids to look at art and illustration and also graphic novels. But I think it's a good framing document, you know, once you've introduced a lot of these concepts, to help kids, if they have this on hand when they're doing an individual or a small group analysis, to have these on hand so they can use, it gives them sort of, he calls them lenses. It gives them lenses with which to look at the pieces. And then also that's a piece from some of the stuff that I do, just as after you've learned them, then to practice, going back and looking at those. And then the other thing, I have to unshare my screen here. Gotta get back where I'm going. Where is it? Oh, it's here. The thumbnails are hiding it. There we go. The other thing I wanted to show is these books. I know a lot of people use Scott McCloud, Understanding Comics and Making Comics with the older kids. This is something I found that really works well with younger kids or people that have never seen, comics before. These are books by James Sturm and some other people from the Center for Cartoon Studies, I think. They built this to help kids, this whole series. They help kids make their own comics. They're really good for understanding comics too, especially for the younger kids. So there you go, a couple of resources.
Great, thanks everybody. So it's the visual nature of comics that actually leads to some of the kind of the friction we see with folks who don't want us using comics in the classroom. And from my experience working with CBLDF and Banned Books Week, those images make comics really easy targets for would-be censors. Persepolis has been censored over a couple of panels depicting torture. Dragon Ball Z has been censored because it features incidental or comedic nudity that's acceptable in Japan but not in the US. A depiction of a clinical breast self-exam in Dan Clo's 8-Ball actually led to the firing of a teacher, and a lot of comics aren't included in classroom collections because of nudity. So how do you balance the values of your community with the desire to present comics in the way that creators intend them to be presented? Shveta, can you start us on this?
Yeah, I'll start on that. You mentioned Persepolis, and I have encountered these issues of censorship in my teaching. And I'll speak to, return to what Laurence was speaking about earlier with building that homeschool connection early on. And I found that if you have that culture in your school or just within your own classroom where you're always reaching out to families and communicating your learning objectives and your process for achieving them, it's a lot easier. And when the parents see the enthusiasm that their that their children are bringing home, that they prioritize your homework, or that they won't put that book down at the dinner table, or they keep talking about it, that helps a lot. But just some logistics on kind of how to achieve that. So that personal goals chart I shared earlier, where I'm providing a menu of learning objectives and end goals, and students are really taking the time to choose them for themselves, that gets sent home. And so parents are learning from the beginning, what is my student embarking on, and how are they going to get there, and what's the value. But also, when we talked earlier about the value of just looking at individual panels or corners of a panel or just one page, we can accomplish a lot without having to see, some of these texts we're working with are tomes. So there are a lot of reasons why we wouldn't necessarily cover every single page. But even more than that, in the high school classroom, I engage students in that conversation about banning content, about censorship. And we really use that as a teachable moment to think about why this text and not that text. Let's look at something that was graphically written in a canonical text we read earlier this year, and let's compare that to what we could potentially encounter in Persepolis and open up that dialogue as well.
Any other advice from the rest of the panel?
I just want to add, like, yeah, I mean, especially dealing with elementary, I before all this, I took my students to the D. Young Museum in San Francisco. They said there was highly inappropriate work of art because of nudity, right? And so, but the parent, you know, so I bring this up because even when going through the march and the civil rights, like that's a triggering topic for a lot of my students and families. So some, you know, like, so how do you bring this up? And that's why I do the preview of like, hey, heads up, we're heading towards this. This is what my plan is. And then folks can check out, opt out, and then, but I always start with like, you know, lower hanging fruit, right? To develop that idea of like, okay, we're going to be looking at comic books, right? And then, or graphic novels. And then like you ratchet up a little bit more, letting them know. And so that's just my piece, that like, a lot of things can be questionable depending on the perspective, right? And so in the end, it's National Geographics, when we were doing like, when we're doing collages, I have to go through and we have to have that talk with the students about what may or may not be, you know, appropriate in their eyes. And so we talk about that. And so just having those honest conversations, prepping them. I don't just jump into something. We do a lot of build up, and then also, hey, like when we go through, we look at those old Dr. Seuss comics. I would say, here's some comics. Like we'll lead up to that and kind of get them, the students, in the right frame of mind to kind of be more critical. And then we analyze, right? Versus just throwing out. Sometimes I'll just throw it. I'll give them a little prep, and then I'll let them generate whatever comes out. Sometimes it's like humor. Sometimes it's like, oh, that's mess. And then we gotta go into, but at least they're ready and having that critical sense on.
Great, thank you so much. Anybody else? Okay, let's talk resources. So teachers and librarians are always looking for resources. On which resources do you personally rely? And do you have a place online where you share your materials for others to use?
I'll start. If you're looking to, as an educator, get comics into your classroom, the best thing that you can do is become very friendly with your local comic shop. 100%. Not only is that the best thing for you because that is your knowledgeable source, but it's best for the local business as well. I am a regular presence at my local place here in Temecula because not only do they exhibit a lot of interest in what I'm doing in the classroom, because it is going to be their future customer and they are lovers of the craft, they're also ones to point me towards new texts that are going to serve my use well. Oh, you're looking to do character, you're looking to do interesting things with narrative and plot, check out what Image is doing, check out what Boom is doing. The people down at SoCal Games and Comics in Temecula are like, they're really good at also getting me off that beaten path. They get me away from the big two more often than I would myself. That is my go-to number one, is the people that make a living in this medium.
I just want to add, like, I wholeheartedly agree 100%. I went to my local comic book store, which is Amazing Comics in Long Beach. They also have a website. But I went in one day and said, hey, I'm going to do a lesson on panels. And the guy behind the counter, Jason, he was so excited. Oh my God, you got to see this artist and the way he's working with different shapes of panels. And look at page 32. Oh, you could do a whole lesson just on this page. And he did. He gave me a whole week's worth of lessons on panels that I wouldn't even have done or wouldn't even have thought about if I hadn't gone to my local comic book store. And then the week before that, when I was just getting resources for my splash page analysis, I just went to the back and they have all these dollar bins. And I spent $32 because I have 32 kids in my class so that each person could have a comic book. And it was the best $32 I could have ever spent. So yeah, local comic book stores for the comics, definitely. Oh, and I got Disney comics at the dollar store this year. So you never know where you're gonna find them.
Unmuted, there we go. I'd like to make a little point here for librarians. So your school librarian, your public librarians, you know, librarians were really out ahead of the curve on comics and graphic novels, even ahead of teachers, and I think the teachers are now catching up. So I would definitely check with your librarian resources. There's also a comic and graphic novel roundtable as part of the ALA. They have a group on Facebook you can join, and then also there is a group on Facebook called Comic Book Teachers, I think is the name of it, and that's actually how I met a few of you, and it's a really great place for sharing resources.
I want to add a couple of texts that will support you with your lesson planning and ready-made activities. These are maybe geared towards the secondary level, but most of us have already kind of referred to some of the big three, the Scott McCloud and Will Eisner books that have probably informed a lot of our own critical understanding of the complexity of the form. But what I want to show as well that I came to later was Jessica Abel and Matt Madden drawing words and writing pictures. And they taught courses at the college level for a long time, but they're fully made lesson plans that are adaptable for different grade levels and time, the amount of time you might have. And their website is just chock full of additional printable, ready to use resources as well. So instead of, you know, they don't just show you how, but then they give you the tools as well. And then finally, this is just golden. I am sad that it took me so long to discover it, but 99 Ways to Tell a Story, Exercises in Style by Matt Madden. He takes one scene basically of him procrastinating writing and one page, and he illustrates it in 99 different ways. So the same event from all sorts of perspectives and styles, narrative styles, artistic styles. And it's been so valuable in the classroom to help students see what's possible and so many activities that you can do with that. So those are just some special tools I found along the way.
Yeah, and you reminded me of something. I grabbed it from my shelf. This is a book by Meryl Jaffe and Talia Hurwitz. It's great. It came out last year, Worth 1,000 Words. And it's actually, it takes graphic novels, everything from Baby Mouse at the lower levels all the way up to something like March. And it actually gives classroom activities and a lot of really good resources in here too. So I recommend that one.
All right, thanks for the recommendations. And I know LT had some recommendations in his presentation as well. So, you know, check the recording, get the information. I'm going to share my screen just momentarily to share some web resources with y'all. If I can get this to work.
We all have the same problem. There we go.
All right. Okay, can you guys see that okay? All right, so these are a couple of web-based resources. The American Library Association, which librarians have been mentioned, has a graphic novel and comics roundtable. Great resource for looking for recommendations. Banned Books Week, for whom I work for, just a little bit of self-plug, has a lot of resources, not only to help you celebrate Banned Books Week, but also activities and programs that can be used year-round, especially if you're teaching about censorship. Comic Book Legal Defense Fund is amping up their education program. I've got a new education coordinator, and she's doing a lot of amazing work. CBLDF also has a lot of tools that you can use when you have a reluctant administrator or fellow teachers who are like, I don't know about comic books in the classroom. They have stuff like Raising a Reader, Panel Power, and lots of tips for how you can add comics to your classrooms. A couple of kind of review type resources, No Fly, No Tights, School Library Journal. We've got comics in the classroom practices from the San Diego school district. And then the Also Great Graphic Novels for Teens list is a really good resource for recommendations. A few other resources, Book List, the Center for Cartoon Studies Teaching Comics. They've got some teaching resources there. Diamond Bookshelf has resources, Manga Bookshelf. NCTE, the National Council of Teachers of English, is a strong advocate if you run into a censorship issue. They firmly believe in the students' right to read. Reading with Pictures, and We Need Diverse Books are a couple other resources. And just a quick plug for CBLDF. In 2019, the fund started surveying teachers about how comics are being used in classrooms, because we have a lot of anecdotal evidence, but we don't have a lot of numbers to apply to how they're being used. And so CBLDF has started putting numbers to that. The results of the first survey are available online, and we're going to be releasing a survey in 2020 sometime in May, so check the website. And please, I encourage everybody who's teaching with comics to respond to the survey, because the more information we have, the more numbers we have to convince the world that comics are valid literature and valid teaching tools, the better. So, and with that, I want to thank our panelists. This is some contact information for them. We've got Tracy, Derek, Shveta, Jennifer, and Laurence. Thank you so much for joining us today. And please reach out to them for tips, for information. We'll do our best to make these resources available to you guys online.
They'll be in the description of the video. They're going to link to everything in there.
All right. Thanks, Tracy. And any final words from the panelists before we go?
Read comics.
All right, let me figure out how to stop sharing. All right, thank you guys so much for joining us, and let's go ahead and stop that recording, Derek.
Thank you, Betsy.